supply side causes of a current account deficit. Let's say number one, you have low labor productivity. Now that's a very important supply side cause, because remember that low labor productivity ka matlab hota hai that it means low output per worker, right? So if your output per worker, or you can say low output per hour, whatever it is, a low output per hour per worker maybe, right? So एक worker एक घंटे में कितने units produce कर रहा है, इसका मतलब basically ये है. So if that is low as compared to the competitor countries around the world, so let's suppose Pakistan, the competitor country in agricultural products, is, let's say, right? For instance, it depends upon what the labor productivity of Pakistan is compared to the labor productivity of India. So labor productivity of Pakistan is lower than the labor productivity of India. So obviously, that would result into a cost advantage to India. It would make their goods more competitive, right? Because that would result into a fall in their average cost, and they will benefit from labor economies of scale, right? India would benefit from labor economies of scale, and that would result. And so for example, let's say Pakistan was exporting to, let's say, China, and India can also export to China. So now India's goods are more competitive. So China will import from India, not from Pakistan. That is what I mean. So that would result into a fall in export revenues for Pakistan, hence resulting into a declining trade balance, hence worsening your current account deficits, or maybe causing a deficit on the current account, right? Because it will reduce the demand for exports, and hence it would reduce the export revenues that are being generated. So yeah, that is one factor. The next factor is high minimum wages, right? Now, obviously, if the minimum wages in Pakistan are higher than that of the competitor countries like India, right? So let's say if there are no minimum wage laws in India, or the minimum wages in India are very low. So in that case, again, the unit labor cost, so what will happen is that if India's minimum wage is low than Pakistan's, right? In that case, what is going to happen is that the unit cost of labor, that is labor cost per unit, basically, is just telling us labor cost per unit. So the labor cost per unit would be very low. That is, what do you mean by labor cost per unit? Labor cost per unit का मतलब होता है एक यूनिट के ऊपर कितना लेबर का खर्चा आ रहा है. तो अगर मिनिमम वेजेस ही इंडिया में नहीं होंगे या बहुत कम होंगे, तो लेबर का खर्चा भी कम आएगा ना फिर हर यूनिट पे. And that would make the product more competitive, and that would reflect into the prices as well. And again, demand for Pakistan's exports will fall, and demand for India's, and that would result into a deficit on Pakistan's current account, because the balance of trade on Pakistan's current account will worsen, right? So the third is poor investment, right? Yes, the third factor is poor investment. Investment means that you are putting in money, or you're buying your capital machinery and equipment, right? That is what investment in economics is, when you allocate money to buying or increasing your capital stock. That is, you buy more machinery and equipment, right? That is what investment is. So if your investment is very poor, which means you don't invest a lot in capital machinery, and your capital machinery is outdated and it's depreciating and it's inefficient, maybe because it's costly to maintain or whatever, right? So that would definitely increase the cost of production than your competitor countries, whose capital machinery would be more productive, more efficient, and that is what will give a competitive edge, or that would increase the competitiveness of, let's say, Indian exports, and that would reduce the demand for Pakistani exports, and hence it would reduce the demand for Pakistani exports and decrease the export revenues for Pakistan, right? So again, these are the three reasons. These are one of the three reasons that we have. Sorry, any questions up till now? And it would cause a deficit on the current account as well. Okay. So the fourth factor that would cause a deficit on the current account is your higher relative inflation. Relative ka word kyun likhna? Because when you talk about relative, you're talking about in relation to other countries. So if Pakistan's rate of inflation is higher to the competitor countries like India, so if in that case the price competitiveness of exports will be lower. What do you mean by that? It means that Pakistani exports would not be competitive because there's a lot of inflation in Pakistan. खुद सोचें अगर पाकिस्तान में there's आपके ख्याल में पाकिस्तान आपको पता है this happened because a few years ago Pakistan's cotton was exported throughout the world, but now we don't export a lot of our cotton industry has been severely affected because of high rates of inflation in Pakistan because we have high levels of cost push inflation. So and that is why we say कि जब cost push inflation आती है, it not only affects the domestic economy, it also affects our exports because it damages the competitiveness of exports. And that is why, and again, that causes a deficit on the current account as well. So this is the reason that if you have a high relative inflation, and when we're talking about a high relative inflation, we're talking about cost push inflation in the economy, right? That is making your exports uncompetitive, right? Because the cost of your exports, the cost of producing those goods that will be exported is quite high. Number 5 reason, another very good reason is that you have, for instance, if there are government restrictions on free trade, that is trade barriers, right? So for example, if Pakistan is exporting cotton to China, right, and that is very beneficial for Pakistan. But what if China imposes a trade barrier on Pakistani exports? Maybe a tariff or a quota or an embargo, whatever. So again, that would hit Pakistani exports because let's say if China imposes a tariff on Pakistani exports, so the Pakistani exports would become expensive. And if they become expensive, in that situation, the demand for देखो ये मत लिखना कि exports will fall. पहले reason देना. Chain of analysis is very important. The demand for exports will fall. When the demand for exports fall, export revenues are significantly affected. And that causes worsening of the trade balance on the current account and ultimately causing or leading to a deficit on the current account balance, right? Then there's a big possibility the country loses its comparative advantage, right? Country loses its comparative advantage. Remember that you need to understand that हमें comparative advantage का मतलब होता है that you're able to produce something at a lower cost of production. And with time, if you don't improve yourself, if you don't invest in research and development, if your labor is not productive, if you don't improve your skills, if your labor is not mobile, right? And if there is a lot of structural unemployment taking place, or maybe if there's a lot of unemployment taking place, whether it's structural or whether it's demand deficit or whatever, and if your labor becomes unemployed for a long period of time, then your labor becomes immobile as well. And these kind of problems will ultimately lead to a country losing its comparative advantage. And if the country loses its comparative advantage over another country, so for example, if Pakistan had a comparative advantage over India, then if Pakistan may lose that comparative advantage over India. So again, that is again a big reason. And as a result of that, the export industry of Pakistan will decline. So for example, if Pakistan has a comparative advantage, let's say if Pakistan had a comparative advantage in the cotton production, right? Which means that you have a comparative advantage whenever you can produce anything at a lower opportunity cost, right? So the opportunity cost of producing cotton in Pakistan was very low, maybe because the factor endowment for Pakistan was suitable for producing cotton. The agriculture was like that, right? Maybe the soil was like that, but Pakistan's farmers and labor were highly trained and skilled to produce that. But what if they don't manage or retain those skills? So we will lose a competitive advantage. And if we lose that competitive advantage, again, it would impact our exports and hence significantly declining our export industry, causing huge levels of structural unemployment in the export sector, right? So and इसमें तुम reference दे सकते हो कि since a country, let's say this agricultural product, let's say if it is Pakistan, and Pakistan exports, primarily Pakistan, let's say, exports agricultural products throughout the world. And if Pakistan loses that competitive advantage on agricultural products, then definitely it would have a major blow to the GDP of Pakistan. And the economic growth would severely be impacted, right? And then there is another reason, that is the last reason that causes a deficit on the current account, is your resource depletion, right? Now we all know what resource depletion means, that because resource depletion means that your resources are getting extinct, right? Because खत्म हो रहे हैं आपके resources. They are not sustainable they are not sustainable for the future population. And when your resources are depleted, that results into severe negative consequences on sustainable economic growth. That is not the topic right now, but remember that you need to understand that this is a very strong argument. This is a very strong argument in the case of developing countries in particular, right? Where extraction and, let's say, mining laws and regulations do not exist or are not enforced. Developing countries, like poor countries, because poor countries they can't be very strict. So the government intervention in developing countries is not to that extent. Why? Because the developing country government intervention increases cost, right? Cost बढ़ जाती है ना, firms पे demotivate and disincentivize हो जाते हैं. So economic growth is an objective for developing countries, so that they can grow and emerge and then ultimately become developed economies, so that they can become more developed. They have structural changes, like from primary sector to the growth of secondary and then the growth of tertiary sector, and that is how they will grow. But if they constantly impose strict government regulations, how will they grow then? So in that sense, what I'm saying is that developing economies, like I said, this question hai, this is mainly talking about a economy that relies heavily on agricultural products, means it's a developing economy like Pakistan. Because इसका मतलब है कि country जो है ना, country के जो exports हैं, agricultural product export कर रहा है, and that is primarily determining the future of the current account balance. Country जो है वो agricultural products export कर रहा है, and that is primarily determining the future of the current account balance. So remember that whenever you are, तुम ये जो भी reasons दे रहे होगे, so for example, if you're saying that there's recession abroad, so you could say that your demand for exports for agricultural products will fall. So if you're saying demand for exports will fall, you could say that demand for exports for agricultural products will fall, since the question is talking about agricultural products, right? But it's not necessary that you give this reference in every reason that you mentioned, right? Just once or twice or maybe thrice you can give it, but not in every. Whatever you are comfortable at, whatever you can easily comfortably write in the exam. So resource depletion के बारे में मैं आपसे ये कह रहा था कि remember that firms are profit maximizers. They are they have their own self-interest. They don't care about the environment, because it talks about resource depletion. Yeah, so it talks about resource depletion, and you guys know that जो developing countries होते हैं, poor countries होते हैं, that these countries focus a lot on agricultural production, right? They not only focus on agricultural production for domestic GDP, but also for exports as well, right? Exports भी उनकी primarily dependent होती हैं, क्योंकि उनके पास skill set ही इसका होता है. उनके पास comparative advantage ही agricultural products में, primary commodities में होता है. तो agricultural products को guys हम primary commodities भी कह सकते हैं. ये primary commodity थोड़ा heavy word है, सही है ना? एग्जामिनर को खुश करेगा. तो प्राइमरी कमोडिटीज में होता है, लिख लो उसको. तो इससे क्या होता है कि यही एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं. अब मसला ये है कि अगर रिसोर्स डिप्लीशन हो, अब बहुत गौर से सुनना मेरी बात, अगर रिसोर्स डिप्लीशन हो रही होगी ना, रिसोर्सेज डिप्लीट हो जाएंगी, तो खास तौर पे नेचुरल रिसोर्सेज, यू नो दैट एग्रीकल्चरल प्रोडक्ट्स एंड प्राइमरी कमोडिटीज आर डिपेंडेंट ऑन देयर प्रोडक्शन is dependent on natural resources, right? Their production is dependent on natural resources, heavily dependent on natural resources. So if there's rapid resource depletion, then ultimately export of primary commodities will not be sustainable in the long run. And then these developing economies, bichare developing economies, will drastically suffer, because that will result into huge deficits, since they are dependent, right? They have over specialized in it. Remember, we talked about the disadvantage of free trade as well. We talked about over specialization. We talked about that countries should specialize in which they have a comparative advantage. But then we also talked about that there is a risk of over specialization. Now, these poor countries, they over specialize in these primary commodities as a means to earn income through export revenues. So the problem is that if the resources are depleted drastically, then their balance of trade will be drastically affected negatively, and it will result into a huge deficit on current account. Because remember, इसको लिख लो that primary commodity export revenue, लिख लो इसको, मैं लाइन लिखवा रहा हूँ because this line is directly linked with your question, that it says लिख लो primary commodity export revenue is the major source of export revenue for these countries, right? Primary commodity export revenue is a major source of export revenue for these countries. Hence, depleting such resources will drastically reduce export revenue, worsening the trade balance, of the current account, causing a current account deficit. But that's it. So we हमने एक और टॉपिक कवर कर लिया आज की क्लास में, that is the causes of the current account deficit, and इसके ऊपर क्वेश्चन भी आ चुका है पास्ट पेपर में, and you nail it if you write these points, inshallah.